Okay, I'll open it up now for questions. I would ask people to keep it as brief as possible because obviously we are running over a bit. So I'll take down these hands now and I'll call the guy at the front first, followed by you in the white shirt. And keep your hands up and I'll write you down now.
Yeah, Guy presents a picture of society in which there are multiple classes, in which there is antagonism really between all of them, as they all have differing interests. And I think the test of whether that vision of society stands up is to see what happens when one group amongst these different stratifications embarks on struggle. And that's why I think that thing starts to fall down. Because if you look at what's happened in Britain over the fight over pensions, you would see a group that I think I would regard as somewhat privileged. People in, by and large, insecure employment, working in the public sector, sometimes working for reasonable money, fighting for pensions which are not available to all workers, therefore fighting in defence of their own privileges, so it might be thought. Except that when you ask people who had to go out and fight to get a vote to go on strike, what arguments did they have to use to motivate people? Was narrow self-interest the argument that really motivated people for the big yes votes? Far from it. People were very interested in the charts that told them how much more they were going to be paying and how much less they were going to be receiving. But the biggest motivating factor was the idea that you were going to be paying more so that the bankers could retire earlier, so that the bankers could have more. The biggest motivating arguments were that you were fighting for the public sector, that you were fighting for the ethos of the public sector against the threat of privatisation and the threat of dismemberment. And therefore, it's very interesting that rather than being narrow self-interest that motivated people to fight, but the idea that they were fighting for the future, for their children and grandchildren, for the future of society. That was why the strike was so successful and so large. But the other thing that I think is interesting, that I think calls into question Guy's analysis, is what effect does the strike have on the people who weren't directly involved in it? Was it the case that those people who did not have pensions and were not part of the public sector looked upon the millions of people who were on strike and thought, bastards, they're all out for themselves? I think you ask anyone in this room, what we found was that around the country, people who were not directly involved themselves overwhelmingly worked and showed sympathy and solidarity with people who are fighting. Why? It's not in their own interest to do it. Why did they feel it? Because they felt they were part of a class with those people who were fighting. They shared common interests, they shared the same goals. Ultimately, though, they knew that their battle was my battle, and that's why they were felt it. And I think this is not just a point that you can see in Britain. Very interestingly, I think you can see in an enormous strike that took place in India 2 months ago. One of the biggest strikes, I think, in world history. Which is interesting in terms of both its size and scale in a country which is supposed to be where capital is relocated to free itself from unions. But it's also interesting in the case that in where the strike was at its most successful, it drew in hundreds of thousands of unorganised workers, i.e. the people who are supposed to be most precarious, the people who are most likely to be on the fringes of working class organisation, can be drawn into working class organisation in the process of battle. If all these classes are antagonistic and see each other as competitors and enemies, how do we explain the drive towards unity that exists in every struggle?
My name is Tim Flossman from the Bristol SWP, and I'd just like to address my point to Kevin Duggan, who said in his address that the significance of a claim is inversely proportional to the amount of evidence that supports it. Well, if that is the case, can I ask why you spent so long throwing statistics at us? Does that mean that you were making a very small point? I'd also like to point out that the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I'd also like to point out that you must realise that employers have got a very strong vested interest in suppressing any information that supports the way that workers are having their terms and conditions degraded. I think that it is true that workers do face deteriorating terms and conditions. The public pensions strike is one of them. I feel that workers also have decreased expectations of the satisfactions that they can draw from their jobs and the fairness that they can expect from their employers. They face increased demands from their employers. They face stricter work disciplines. Employers foster a lack of confidence and assertiveness amongst their workforce, and if they do find workers that are confident, then they will take steps to move against them. Employers are increasingly ready to use trade union busting tactics, and just because there is a lack of evidence, it does not mean that it's going on. As I said, powerful interests have a very strong vested interest in suppressing that evidence.
Okay, we've got the woman here, and then the guy behind you.
Right, Sheila McGowan. I suppose I'm part of the Solariat, and I suppose I'm possibly one of the highest paid people in the room, I suspect, because under the previous government they had to, I guess so, because I'm a head of department in a secondary school, and actually we got very big in London increases in pay about 10 years ago as a result of strike action that we took. And I say that as a practice, what I'm now going to say. You see, I briefly touched on it this morning. Since January, where there was a restructuring package introduced in our school, and it affected not just the teachers, it affected the support staff. And the support staff in schools are paid very, very low wages indeed, right? And the three things were an increase in teacher workloads, increasing the hours that we teach, pay cuts to the support staff, and redundancies for both sectors. What is interesting about it is we got everybody to meet together, joint union meetings. We agreed, all of us, that we weren't going to accept any of it, and we agreed, all of us, that we were going to take strike action. What is interesting about the ballot, however, is that the ballot for strike action amongst people like me, the higher paid, was much higher than the ballot result amongst the lower paid. But because we had done it in a united fashion, and because of the local circumstances in terms of the left, in terms of local union organisation, we were able to strike together. And there's no question about it that it was the unity which meant that the low pay, that their ballot result under normal circumstances, the union would have allowed them to strike. They would have stopped it, being unison. But because we were united, they allowed the strike to go ahead. Right? And because of that, we have been able to win. We've stopped the pay cuts, and we've stopped the pay cuts for the lower paid. We've stopped the compulsory redundancies, we've got redeployment, and we've come to certain sort of the compulsory redundancies. The outstanding thing is the question of workload, and it is bitter. It is incredibly bitter, the highest paid, if you like, inside the school. It's also true of the support staff. Our feeling, we do not feel privileged. Precisely the opposite has actually happened to us over the last number of years. We feel increasingly as if we're on a production line. We feel like production line workers because we are told what to teach, when to teach it. We're told when to input data, how to evaluate, and all the rest of it. We are just doing like this. It's actually like being on your year is now like being on a production line. In other words, I don't recognise this picture of the Solariat that you're talking about, and at the same time, it is taken against the backdrop of pension cuts, pay freezes, and all the negative effects of the benefit cuts, which actually affect people in all sorts of other ways. And the key thing I want to end up on is this. Through the collective action, the solidity now between the higher and the lower paid inside the school is actually massive. And that is exactly the argument we put in the 60s and 70s when we said that the better organised people inside the working class movement who fought to defend pay would open up the doors for the lower pay to go through. The hospital workers followed the miners, and they followed the car workers, and so did the teachers. And the teachers as well organised now as a result of actually following on the backs of the well-organised high-paid workers in the 60s and 70s.
Just to illustrate, I won't talk about the global south overall. It's very different. I will talk about what's been the experience in Mexico, which is the country. There's been evidently a radical recomposition of the labor markets, and even I would say transformation of the labor regime in general. But what I would like to focus is in the idea that this has been a very long process. The process began in Latin America, in Mexico, based on IMF-led general austerity measures, the ones that we are seeing here in Europe. But it's taken 15, 20, 25 years, so we have to be very alert. In the first stage, 70s and 80s, there was a widespread resistant collective movement based in unions. But systematically, the collective strikes were defeated. The resistance didn't have a positive project, so that was a problem. What happened? There was a very deep contraction through inflation of direct wages. You know about it, 70% minimum wage loss, 35% manufacturing wage. There was also a big reduction in public employment. In a second stage, which is very important, very qualitative, was the individualization of labor relations through productivity and efficiency bonus. They tell you what to do, how to do it. A flexibilization of functions, a flexibilization of wages. There's a big increase in wage differences. You can measure it intra-firm, intra-sectoral, intersectoral, regional. Another outstanding, I'm going to finish two things. Another outstanding element is the outsourcing of labor contracts. I think this is also quantitative but qualitative, because wage laborers that work through outsourcing, they don't directly sell the labor force, they sell a service. So they are in a different logic. Just to end, I agree that it was difficult in Mexico, but I think we are advancing in the strategic idea that the struggles must unite the formal workers that still have a union, that still receive benefits, that are less than 50%, the underemployed, informal, precariats, and the unemployed. That's the only way that we can still resist and try to advance in a more positive phase of struggle.
Okay. And then
I think that on the question of Occupy in particular, it's quite interesting, because if you think about it, regardless of the kinds of ideas that were quite, it was quite a heterogeneous sort of movement, lots of different ideas floating around, but the slogan of Occupy was not "We are the precariat." The slogan of Occupy was "We are the 99%." And I think that that's a very, very important factor, because if you look at the trajectory of the Occupy movement, when it was on the upwards, when it was going ahead, that idea of unity and coming together and struggling together was what created a serious sense of trouble and confusion amongst the ruling class, certainly in America and other places. It's where the struggle has gone down, where you've seen the lack of ability to maintain mobilizations, that these kinds of ideas about precarity have become a little bit more entrenched. I want to read you a brief quote that I use in an article that I wrote in the new issue of the International Socialism Journal, where someone in the Occupy Oakland movement, a group in the Occupy Oakland movement, talk about the strike no longer appears only as the voluntary withdrawal of labour from a workplace by those employed there, but as the blockade, suppression or sabotage of that workplace by proletarians who are alien to it. I mean, you can see a logic in that is very similar to the kinds of disastrous logic that was at work in some of the ultra-left of the Italian movement in the late 1970s, a symptom of a defeat, whether ongoing or temporary, that leads to this idea that those workers we can't work with anymore. I think our argument surely has to be building on, for example, what Esme said about Geoffrey de Stecquois. What his argument isn't that all workers are the same, but that all workers, because of their role in society, have a material basis for solidarity that overcomes these kinds of differences. The final point I want to make Of course, none of these things are automatic, and things matter. What we do matters. What we do matters. But when we talk about, are not really, of course, there have always been precarious workers. I mean, for example, dock labouring is at all times a precarious and uncertain mode of living, said a docker in Liverpool in 1882. But of course, we can take that a little bit further. I mean, when Marx was writing, precarity was the natural state of affairs for the entire proletariat. Why is it that it isn't that case now? It isn't because the salariat have been given things, that these things have been given away. It's been through hard-fought struggles of unionisation, of organisation over decades and decades and decades. And the lesson to take from that isn't, and I don't want to get into the empirical arguments because, I mean, there's enough of a to-do going on there. Even if the empirical arguments were true and there was a huge burgeoning of precarious work, our job wouldn't be to say, oh, these are different now, what makes them different? Our job has to be, how do we organise together? How do we unite to fight together? And I think those are the central things we have to take out of this discussion when we put them into practice in the struggles to come.
So I apologise if anything is repetitive. Just in terms of class, I want to just draw upon it would be in striving for sort of economic justice, one of the best expression of how it would be great to use Marx's definition to unite people in terms of class being in relation to the economy. However, there is just based on the August riots, I've never known such a division between people and friends who I thought would have been sort of on my kind of page, not that who were completely brought in to this mindless criminality, even though they came from the same area as me, where we've been called mindless criminals, driving the trolley around, whatever you do when you're away. So that issue, and in this more broadly, there is a massive amount of pitching people against each other, and it kind of I'm Spartacus of oppression, as I call it, is really, really getting in the way, it's who's most oppressed. And it reflects so much the deserving and undeserving war, so it's a real reflection of capitalism in that sense. But in the fight against that, one of the things I find really, really difficult is how, it's in obvious ways, but it's in very subtle ways, that this idea of the ruling class being legitimate, it occurs, and it's just it's being thrown at you, all this imagery, everything from what not to eat, when the ruling class comes in and shows the working class person how to eat and how to dress and all the rest of it. So it's very, very subtle in that way, and it positions that legitimacy within the ruling class, and subsequently it kind of recruits a lot of the working class where it shouldn't. And sorry, the other point I wanted to make there quickly was regarding people using the saying stupidity, this idea of stupidity of the ruling class, and the class it's true, and also it's a bit of a flippant thing to say in terms of terminology, as it's dangerously taken away a kind of responsibility. And when I was sitting in the first session, I was looking out the window, and there was just a absolute barrage of stop and search going on, right? So I've written down stop and search, I've written down this idea of every time my phone goes into a new flat, it is a complete, panoptic idea, the kind of place that's code walked in, you'd be like, are you serious, right? Completely, it's like the stupid law, the so whatever thing they're going to flash out with the Olympics if anyone misbehaves. And in terms of that as evidence to show there is something very intentional about what's going on, because if they think, if the ruling class thinks their structure is going to work, why are they preparing for this increased militarisation? Sorry.
Thank you. No, him first. Sorry, this guy first and then you.
I find this a very interesting discussion. I've not read either of Kevin's book or Guy's, but I will do. What I find really interesting is that up until about an hour ago, I had no idea that the idea of precarious work or precariat would be a concept which some people would take issue with. Almost like, oh no! If we identify precariat, that's replacing the working class. or it's some kind of attack on labour history or the trade unions or previous. No, it's not. That's not. I mean, I've no idea what Guy says in his book because I've not read it. But my understanding of precarious, of being in the precariat, I mean, it's certainly a phrase I've used for education purposes in recent weeks and months, and it goes down very well because a lot of people psychologically at least feel very unsafe in their work. Whether or not it's empirically true or not is another issue, but we're not. We have to question the psychology. People do feel scared, and I think saying precariat, not as a replacement for proletariat. I mean, so we don't offend anybody, we maybe say precarious proletariat or something. But the idea is this juxtaposition. People this knee-jerk reaction. The newfangled anarchist phrase or something, well, I imagine that's what probably a lot of people say. I don't see it that way at all. The lady there, not there anymore, Emily Hartman, what she was describing, I thought she was going to end up by saying, so that makes me part of the precariat. She said, oh, that makes me part of the cell area. I found that very, very, very bizarre. And the gentleman there, it seems to be juxtaposing this idea of public sector workers and precarious workers who apparently are not in the public sector for some reason, potentially loggerheads. Of course not. Of course there can be unity. Of course there is unity, potential unity amongst all workers, because all workers probably feel precarious on one level or another. So my main point here to sum up is I'm interested in the knee-jerk reaction against this phrase, which statistics notwithstanding, that's a separate argument, the empirical stuff, but psychologically, I'm very interested in how people react to a word which you think will be sent from God as a propaganda technique, at least what leads to how most people are actually feeling at the moment.
I want to respond directly to that point because I think there are very good reasons why we should be sceptical of the use of the term precariat, because actually Guy's presented a very careful use of the term. The problem is what happens when these kind of quite abstract intellectual arguments seep into the canteen at work, to the lecture theatre, and to the workplace. And I think these kind of arguments can reinforce the notion that the working class is a sort of Goldilocks porridge class, in which it's either too hot or too cold and never just right to fight. It's either too bought off or too downtrodden to fight back. And in the case of Slavoj Žižek, as me talked about the article, it's both. You're either the salaried bourgeoisie who blend into management, or you're downtrodden, a slum dweller oppressed, and you can never fight back. These are arguments that can be purchased over groups of workers, and we should fight against anything that reinforces the notion. I also think factually it's complete nonsense. If you look at the figures, I mean, the latest figure I had for the number of people who are in temporary contracts and want to be on permanent contracts, or are part-time and want to be full-time, is about 1.9 million in Britain. Now that's a significant chunk of people. We should fight their cause and all the rest of it. But it's about 6% of the workforce in Britain. You'd think from the academic discourse it was 60 or 70% of the workforce in Britain. We have to understand the scale of this kind of problem. It's true that Guy says that the critical thing is control of the job. I want to know, when is this magical period in which workers have control of the job? There are constant battles over control of the jobs under capitalism. It varies enormously historically. And at the moment, I think Sheila's absolutely right. It's groups of people that you would identify as a salariat in many cases who are most having their control of the job undermined. People like herself in the public sector and elsewhere. There are constant battles over this. But they can also be a place in which people begin to understand their collective strengths precisely by fighting over the question of control over the job. So one final point, really, which is about, so two final points. One is about globalisation. I don't think it's useful to show that companies are employing more people abroad by looking at multinational capital. That seems to me a silly argument. Of course multinational companies are employing more people abroad, they're multinationals. Let's look at capitalism as a whole, and let's look at the patterns of investment by capitalism as a whole. Very, very last point is that when you talk about habituation of workers, it seems to me you're making the very mistake that Esme identifies. You're talking about workers' consciousness. Surely we have to go back to a structural power the possibilities raised by the position of the working class under capitalism. Of course, their confidence doesn't necessarily coincide with that, but surely one of the things that we have to do is de-habituate people to a sense of powerlessness, and I think the notion of precariat is an obstacle to doing that.
I just want to make 2 points which might, in a way, be blindingly obvious to many people. But the first is that I think it's one thing to describe precarious forms of working. It's quite another to argue for the creation of a precariat on the one hand and a salariat on the other. In other words, precarious forms of working and the description of those are not troubling to the Marxist definition of class. In fact, Johnny alluded to the fact that, if you like, precariousness of work, precarious forms of working, are right at the heart of Marx's original description of what the working class is. The spectre of mass unemployment is something that was right there when the working class was created, and it was important in the creation of a class of people who were dispossessed, who had no other option other than to sell their labour to capital. So I think that's the first thing to say. My second simple point is that often when we talk about how work has changed, we talk about what's changed in the past 30 years under neoliberalism in the context of a whole series of defeats of the working class. That's perfectly reasonable. But there is a slight danger if our main point of comparison is the post-war period, and that we take the post-war period as sort of year zero, as kind of the standard model for what the working class looks like. It seems to me that, if anything, the post-war period was the most exceptional in terms of the history of capitalism, where you have relatively low levels of unemployment, where you have a long boom of capital, and you have rising living standards of the working class. It seems to me that if we're to describe, if you like, on the broadest canvas, what's happened in the past 30 years of neoliberalism, it's rather a return to some of the more classical shape of the way that capitalism is, the return of mass unemployment, the return of the fear of unemployment, and the fear of being thrown out of work. So it seems to me that precarious working, it's important to argue over the empirical basis of that, but actually the fact of precarious working is not at all a threat to Marx's definition of class.
Cheers. The next speaker is Despina, and then Mark. But just before Despina speaks, just say this will be all we'll have time for in terms of the discussion, so thanks everyone, and then I'll bring back each of the speakers for 5 more minutes. Okay.
I want to make a point about Greece. One of the speakers said we have a fantastic movement in front of the Syrian Square, the Occupy movement, very political, talk about democracy, etc. And of course it wasn't the only movement, because we have farmers out, we have students occupied the universities, even though school students, we have in September 800 secondary schools in occupation. But I think what is the main machine behind all of this movement is the massive strikes and resistance of working class people. We have in 2 years 16 general strikes. We start with the public sector workers. Workers never thought in their life would be in strikes. In a massive way of 100% participation in strikes. You have places where hospitals, in my personal opinions, people thought about doctors something, very on the top of society. Doctors occupied, hospitals, to fight against the attack. And not only that, we see also the private sector in a very big way, for the first time, coming down on strikes. The Greek TUC produced some figures for 2011 about the year of struggle, and there was in 2011 5,910 demonstrations and different kinds of movements of protest. The average 16 per day, and they have 455 strikes, of which 57 of them was occupation. What is very interesting, because the start of the public sector workers, the main strike, and much bigger percentage at the moment, is in the private sector. They have 3 main strikes, which is the steel workers, which are about 180 days on strike. There is the newspaper, which is occupied by workers. For the first time, produce two occupied workers, and in the middle of the page say two willing bosses, and that there is no loan. And the third big private sector occupation is a private channel TV station, which is under occupation more than 70 years. And of course, in this picture, there's a lot of structure and occupation in a smaller place, like supermarkets and places like that. And not only that, I think is what is fascinating is the migrant workers, because that's what they call these workers. And what happened when the government trying to use them to stop a strike of 10 days in where the dustbin workers were, you know, they have their union, they are part of every general strike coming down their banners, and basically they are translating their languages, wanting to break the strike. This is a struggle, our struggle, is these people have been dust, and the government could not use basically migrant workers. And I think one thing which is, I want to say for the whole day, is the vote to the left in Greece is not like some papers and academic studies, you know, translate what's going on here. It's because there is a massive struggle of working class people, the public and private sector, and I hope we'll tarnish them in the election, but we'll continue to tarnish them on the streets.
Martin, I'm the editor of Social Review. I mean, Guy, in the picture of the social structure that you painted, excluding the billionaires at the top and those who are completely outside the labour market, the central like the Salaria and the Precariat, and you define the Salaria in terms of long-term jobs, employment security, and then use a different criteria for Precariat, which is lack of job security. And I thought that was quite interesting, because it seems to me that idea that you don't control your job is actually the definition of what it is to be working class. And secondly, I think it's very hard to think to any group of workers anywhere in Britain, for example, just off the top of my head, who are not subject to a process of the reorganisation of the labour process and the intensification of work. I mean, I read a very interesting study of the pharmaceutical industry where research and development workers are subject to precisely that process. You know, Sheila described the process as having a massive erosion of any notion of autonomy. And it seems to me that is not really a useful distinction. The Salaria, does rightly though, is totally differentiated. Because I think the criteria has to be the question of exploitation. Has to go back to reinstate the labour theory of values, have a context to see the real antagonism of society. Are you subject to having surplus value plucked out of you, or are you, from the senior managers below the billionaires through to, well, some foremen and supervisors, part of the mechanism of pumping surplus value and driving through exploitation? It seems to me that their Salaria is not a unified class, not a useful concept. Right? And it does seem to me that the objective reality of having surplus value pumped out of you is why there is an objective potential unity between people who do quite different jobs on the basis. There is a potential unity between, I don't know, somebody bin workers and tax collectors because of that objective reality. And I thought it was very interesting about it links back to what we said in the first session, which is the crisis of profitability has meant an intensification of squeezing out surplus value. That's created a communality of experience across very, very different jobs, actually. And actually, if you look at the recession, the point that Kevin made, the burden of the crisis is not being placed on specific industries, it's being shared right across the world. And interestingly, and we shouldn't confuse objective and subjective, it's interesting though, isn't it? There is an era of a return of mass strikes across Europe, albeit often limited 1 or 2 days and so on. But part of what that reflects is a feeling across the working class that we want unity. You know that French slogan, tous ensemble, all together. In other words, the possibility of restoring subjectively the communality of class identification across very different jobs and experiences is getting stronger and not weakening.
Thanks. Okay, I'm going to bring back Kevin to sum up first. You want to come and use the mic?